Good evening, I'm Joleigh Cavanagh. I am here with Josh Pate, host of the Late Kick with Josh Pate podcast. Josh, how are you doing?
I'm good because it is beautiful, because it's Auburn in the almost fall. It is fall now, so
yeah.
We got Georgia in town. The campus is hopping. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So I have a few questions for you. So first, our viewers may not know who you are. College football podcasters listen to you all the time. So if you can introduce yourself, where are you from? How'd you get into sports?
I got into sports the same way pretty much anyone does. I watched them when I was a really little kid, loved them, grew up just east of here in Columbus, Georgia, kind of just north of Columbus. So really familiar with Auburn, watched Auburn growing up a lot. But I just knew I loved this stuff. And so sort of as the mid-20 teens were evolving, the media landscape was evolving too. Like what we're doing, seated right here. We didn't really have this capability a decade ago. You had to have overhead and distribution. You had to be working for a major media company. Someone had to put a check mark on your forehead. You're good enough. And then all of a sudden, anyone who had access to internet, theoretically, could do their thing. And so that didn't mean any guarantees, but it meant you had your shot. And so, you know, the YouTube game, the podcasting game, I think it's been such a talent-rich and opportunity-rich environment for people who do college football, but you could just as soon as be talking about fashion as college football. If you're passionate about it, if you overlap that passion with some good enough talent, that's the field. Like that's where it is now. So Late Kick is on YouTube, podcast, pretty much wherever people want to go.
Awesome. So another question. We are at Eagle Eye Auburn Student Media. Have you ever been to student media, ever been involved on a college campus?
I actually have. I was over in Columbus, Georgia before I came over here today. And right on the corner of 9th and Broad in downtown Columbus, there is the Columbus State University kind of broadcast school. And back when I was there was a little teeny tiny broom closet of a radio studio, and the signal barely made it out of Columbus, maybe 10 people listening, but it did allow you to get repetition, which is the most valuable commodity you can have. Someone who'll give you a live microphone in a studio and the ability to get your reps in. And so I was very involved there. We did some nonprofit stuff over there at a place called the NPACE Center, and I hearken back to that because we learned lessons there, and you sort of hone your craft there. You're still using that today. And you're talking about working at CBS today and drawing on things every day that you worked on in student media, student affairs, student broadcasting. So to be able to have the access like this is a godsend, because most people don't get access to this until they get out and try and have a job delivered to them or put in front of them. And if you don't already have your chops cut a little bit, it can be really difficult.
Yeah, so speaking of that, as a college student who's looking to work in sports, if you could give any piece of advice to a college student who wants to work in sports, what would that be? Very,
very powerful advice that I got that served me well and still serves me well is to never be intimidated by how crowded the field is. Everyone's going to tell you, oh, that market's so saturated. 1 million people want to be sports reporters and want to be talk show hosts, which is true. But that's no reason to be intimidated. It's just like being in a traffic jam. The lane's clogged. It's impossible to hit the gas because you can't go anywhere. That's what our profession can feel like when you're just starting out. All that means is you have to create your own lane. And the advice that I got is the traffic will disappear really quick if you create your own lane. Now in a traffic jam, you can't do that, but figuratively in our world, it just means if you take yourself right now and you define the 5, 6, or 7 unique things about you, your personality, your characteristics, things that are just uniquely you, no one else has those, and you blend them and you pour them out, if you can ever take what's poured out and put that on air, instead of pretending on air the way you think it's supposed to look, that's the difference in being in the traffic jam and creating your own lane. And that unique version of you, if you stick it out, is guaranteed to succeed. Because quite literally, there isn't another one out there. It's impossible for anyone else to be you. And someone gave me that advice a while back, and it removed all the fear and anxiety of being intimidated by how crowded this place was and how many folks who've been here a decade before me were already out there. You just kind of put blinders on like a horse race, and you just run your race with the talents and abilities that you have, and you stick it out and things fall into place.
Wow, I love that. I hope our viewers take that in, because I definitely am going to take that. So I saw on your Instagram you went to SEC Media Days, you interviewed Kirby Smart, Nick Saban, kind of a little bit of a fun question. Any behind the scenes scoops, like any funny moments from Lane Kiffin? I know he's a character, Brian Kelly.
I'll tell you, a lot of those guys give you the best stuff off air. The trade-off is you better not talk about it. But I think a lot of them, what's fun is once you develop a rapport with coaches, they're no different than anyone else. When they trust you, they will share things on a more personal and intimate level with you. Now, like I said, the trade-off is they trust your discretion not to share that. But in a general sense, Brian Kelly, for example, LSU's secondary has been exposed a couple times this year. I don't think that shocked him because he was very forthright with me about saying, that's probably a red flag for us. That wouldn't traffic well on air at SEC Media Days, but it was the truth. I think Kirby Smart, same way. He's coming in here. Georgia's coming in here this weekend. I think Kirby Smart and Georgia's coaching staff look at their product as very incomplete. I think they look at their team as off the mark of the last 2 years' teams, but they're undefeated, and so you can't tell anyone anything like that. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the struggle they've had internally. I think it's the struggle they still have internally. Nick Saban, really brutally honest about NIL, and he's the kind of guy who will tell you, I don't like the way something's going, but if it keeps going that way, I'll just be better at it than anyone else, even if I don't like it. And I always appreciate that. Went to Big Ten Media Days, and a couple of those guys were the same way. So it's always a fun time. I don't think at those events you get so much when guys step to the podium in the big room as you do if you can get access with them off to the side, which is hard to do these days. Just a little side note, not to go on a tangent, but if you get some of these more seasoned beat writers who cover Auburn, like the Philip Marshalls of the world, for example, ask him about the Skywriters back in the day and how pre-media days media worked. And that's when those guys would all get on a plane and go campus to campus and talk to the coaches off the record. Those stories they would fill hours and hours and hours of programming. I never got to live that, but listening to those guys, it's like sitting around a campfire. It's unbelievable.
So speaking of Kirby Smart, Auburn hosts #1 Georgia this weekend. That is why you are here. Last Saturday, you were at Notre Dame, Ohio State. So my question to you is, how did you choose Auburn and Georgia? Why did you choose Auburn and Georgia?
I've gotten that a lot this week. So I already had this one kind of circled. And truth be told, we were probably going to come here no matter what the outcome was of Auburn, Texas A&M. I look at this year already around college football. The last 2 weeks, for example, I've been in a game that was decided on the final play. Just totally chaotic. We've already seen it start to unfold in September. I know it feels like it's been forever, but September's not even over yet. And so if we claim to be in a season of chaos, and I at least claim that we are, you don't look at a game and say, well, that point spread's double digits. Nothing's going to happen there. You instead look and you say, wow, Georgia hasn't been on the road yet. New OC, new quarterback. Hugh Freeze and Auburn lose a game, which puts you in what I'll call wounded animal mode, and you come back home and your back's against the wall, and everyone knows how fired up this place is going to be. It always is for this game, but especially now that your margin for error shrinks a little bit. Big recruiting weekend for Auburn. Like, I look at that environment and I say, I know what that's been a recipe for in the past. Let's go see if it's a recipe for that. And even if it's not an outright upset, now this is me selfishly speaking, if you just get a good, hard-fought 4-quarter game, that's all you can hope for. Now, for you guys, if you go a step further and you pull the outright upset, you may be talking, I don't want to encourage...
Rolling Toomer's corner.
I don't want to encourage field storming around here, but we've seen it in the past. So I've been here several times when Auburn did things it wasn't expected to do, and it's pretty awesome.
I mean, Auburn has been saying it's not crazy till it happens. Miracle at Jordan Hare, kick six, anything could happen. So I know in your podcast you mentioned recently how when a coach who specializes in something specific and it goes wrong the week before, like Auburn offensively, quarterback situation not good, but that's something that Hugh Freeze specializes in, something he's been forthright in telling, like that's something we need to work on. So what do you think that Hugh Freeze is going to do this weekend to improve that offense against Georgia's defense?
I think it's really subtle. I don't even think it's something worth us trying to dive too deep into schematically, because I don't think there's any skill in knowing it. What I do think, if we zoom out 30,000 feet, is like you just said, there is skill in looking and saying, it's one thing if Auburn's defense cost them last week. Auburn's defense has been rock solid. Like, coaches around the conference talk about Auburn and they go defense first. If I'm Hugh Freeze, I take it kind of personally, because that is not the ultimate identity that I want my plays to have. I want people to be scared of how many points we can hang on them. Now, they're not there yet. It's year one. That's understandable. But at the same time, when you have Robbie Ashford here, for example, who didn't get a ton of action last week, this is just blind guesswork. This is not any kind of informed opinion on my part, maybe semi-informed. I wonder if having things go so wrong one week doesn't lead you to sort of shake things up. Now, what you pour out the next week may or may not be better, but there's all the incentive in the world to at least try something new. He being Hugh Freeze, also last week after the game, talked about their play calling mechanics. And again, we don't know how specific we can get on that, but we know if he's talking about it, they've been talking about it internally. And they've having been noticed it internally, probably have incentive to change that. So at the very least, it gives your opposition a big question mark over the top of their head as to which quarterback they're going to see, what are the different offensive mechanics that we're going to see, and also go back and look at Hugh Freeze against Kirby Smart in the past. It has not been easy. And those games, whether Kirby's been at Georgia or Bama, they've always been favored. So it's no different tomorrow than it has been in the past, but Hugh Freeze has found a way before.
You mentioned the quarterback situation. We have Holden Griner, we have Robbie Ashford, Peyton Thorn. What do you think we need to see from specifically Peyton Thorn? We know he's starting. What do you think we need to see from him this weekend in order to pull off this upset?
I think really early, at least the threat of the deep ball. It doesn't even have to be completed. People always think that sounds crazy. Well, why would you talk about needing an incomplete pass? It's just the other guy knowing you're willing to do it that sort of loosens the defense a little bit. And what we don't know, two things we don't know about Georgia. We don't know if their pass rush is elite. They've got a low pressure rate right now, but also teams have been getting the ball out quick. So this is the first week Georgia will have gone on the road, but also the first week they will have faced a team committed to running the ball. And so if you can maintain the semblance of balance, which is not statistical, it's just does the other guy think you're capable of doing either thing? That's real balance. If you can get that early, whether it's any of a number of quarterbacks you just mentioned, I think that's the biggest key for them. Because if you become one-dimensional, it is not difficult for Georgia or half a dozen other defenses in this conference to shut you down. And that's why early scoring, I think, especially for a team like Auburn tomorrow, is imperative. It ideally is offensive, but it could be a defensive score, could be special teams, could be fake punt. Like those kinds of things, I think you go into this game knowing we probably have to try that. We probably got to come 70% of the way. We're not going 50-50 here and just counting on our dudes to outdo their dudes. They've got a better roster than Auburn right now. Maybe in 2 years is different. So that was a really long-winded way of saying throw the ball deep, stretch the defense a little bit.
Yeah, I agree. I know last week against Texas A&M, we saw Peyton Thorn. He had Jay Fair open on a wide play, missed him, Brendan Frazier, but I think if his decision-making can improve, Auburn's offensive line can protect him, we kind of have a chance. Moving on to the defense, a lot of people think Auburn's defense is great. Our secondary is what's going to keep us in games. So how do you think Auburn's secondary, we have Donovan Kaufman, DJ James, Nehemiah Pritchett, how do you think they are going to line up against Georgia receivers like tight end, arguably the best tight end in college football, Brock Bowers, Rara Thomas, Dominic Lovett? How do you think Auburn's secondary is going to be able to protect?
I think pretty good, because I think they can man up when they need to. And that means if I need to dedicate extra attention to Brock Bowers, I can do it. I kind of go back to what I said about 10 minutes ago. You talk to coaches around the conference, and when they talk about Auburn, they talk about the effort that's played with. Now, people take that for granted, and you shouldn't, because it's not a guarantee that players collectively play with high effort. Auburn does. And so your players, I'm not talking about them as if they're a poverty roster, but it doesn't matter if it's a top 5 defensive roster in terms of talent. If you have a top 20 roster, but it plays to a max over the cliff kind of effort, especially against Georgia's wide receiver unit, which has not been anything to write home about this year, they match up more than favorably. And then that's when you leverage crowd noise, because that's when your pass rush can start to accumulate coverage sacks even, and you may see Carson Beck under duress when you only bring 4 because of what you're able to do in the secondary.
You mentioned Carson Beck. How do you think he is going to fare in his first SEC road matchup at arguably one of the toughest road atmospheres in the country?
I have no idea, and I don't know that they do either. I know they're confident in him, but I think there was a fair amount of confidence in this building, in Peyton Thorn, going on the road last week. Not that he was going to light it up for 505 touchdowns, but the ability to play good enough. The road does crazy things to you. The road just like grabs your program by the shoulders and it shakes it. And if everything's not really tied up tight and put together, all of a sudden change starts to fall out of your pockets and your belt comes undone and you're like, wow, we really weren't quite as ready as we thought we were. Now, Georgia historically has been a very good program under Kirby Smart, but not immune to this sort of thing. And it all starts and ends at the quarterback position. And so what do? You know, ask yourself this. You're not one game into the season. It's your fourth game or fifth game if you're Georgia. What do you do if you all of a sudden go on the road and your quarterback is total deer in headlights and it's 3-3 at halftime? They trailed South Carolina 14-3 at home a couple of weeks ago. Coaches are kept up at night with nightmares about that sort of thing because you really don't know until you see your guy. It's a human being. It's a college human being. Until you see them go on the road and process an atmosphere, an environment like this, you just say, okay, let's contingency this. Let's plan a what if, hoping you'll never have to use it.
Auburn has had a lot of surprise players each week step up. We see Eugene Asante, touchdown, a couple different sacks. Who has surprised you most on Auburn's roster this year?
You said the name. Asante was the one I was going to go with because it's the classic preview magazine syndrome, as I call it. It's not a name that you saw plastered across any magazines, but yet you know, especially if you put together a team like Hugh Freeze did, it's so different than the way a team would have been put together even 5 years ago that you know inevitably there are going to be names with a new staff in town, period. There are going to be new names that emerge. They could be homegrown, they could be portal. And that's the fun of the first month because even the most diehard of Auburn fans are going to end up seeing names like his start to emerge and bubble towards the surface that they weren't talking about at their family reunion in July. They weren't talking about that when they started to watch fall camp get started in August. That's not unique to Auburn, but it's specific to Auburn right now because of the different roster dynamic here.
So you spoke of the transfer portal. Something that I've been seeing is have Auburn's transfer portal men, have they stepped up and have they done what they need to be done? Gunnar Britton on the offensive line. We have Shane Hooks. He's been seen as a target a couple of times. He's missed a few balls. How do you think that Auburn's transfer portal additions, have they stepped up to what we thought they were going to be? Peyton Thorn?
I'd say it's case by case. I'd say collectively what I think about those guys is there's still another gear they can hit. And if I were an Auburn fan, I'd be selfishly hoping for the same thing. But it's so different. Like if I'm working at a construction site and the truck brings 3 pallets of bricks to the site in the morning, that's what it takes to build a house. But that's not a house. And just like bringing football players onto campus is what it takes to make a roster is not a team. You have to have the stuff that goes in between, the mortar that goes between the bricks, and it's an intangible. Like I can't put that on a table right now. I can't define that or quantify that for you. But if you've ever been part of team sports, if you've ever been in a locker room, you know when it all of a sudden starts to gel a little bit and collectively you start playing above the level you thought you were capable of because, you know, united front and whatnot. I don't know that they've reached that level here yet, but it doesn't mean they won't. I think there have been flashes, but I think you talk to me again in November, or you just go yourself and you watch this team in November. If they've got the right stuff internally, if they stay bought in, they stay focused, you may find yourself saying, wow, if I could take this team back to College Station and we could play that game over again with this unit looking like this now, could be an entirely different outcome. Now, obviously, you don't get to do that, but it could bode very well for the future. So I would say individually, there are guys I could circle, but that portal class collectively, I still think has a ways to go before it maximizes its potential.
So before we get into final predictions going into this weekend, I want to ask you, where do you see Auburn under Hugh Freeze in the next 3 years? We have a top 15 recruiting class in 2024. We flipped wide receiver Perry Thomas from Alabama, DeMarcus Riddick from Georgia. Where do you see the Auburn program going in 3 years? Are we back to Cam Newton, Nick Marshall level? Where do you think Hugh Freeze can take Auburn?
I think they'll be an SEC championship contender, maybe as soon as next year. And it's gonna raise a lot of eyebrows if you say that, because I think a lot of folks are still married to the old idea that if you start from scratch, it takes 3 years minimum, because that used to be true. And that is just not true anymore. It is absolutely not true. If anything, I think Hugh Freeze being here kind of was a wake-up call for the rest of the conference. Like I was talking to someone earlier, some people took shots at Auburn when they hired Hugh Freeze. What you'll notice is no coaches around the SEC chimed in, because they've played against him before. Like, they know what he's about. They weren't happy when Auburn hired Hugh Freeze, just for much different reasons than the general public. When he gets his guys in here, and using the portal will make that happen a lot faster. When he gets his kind of guy in here, you don't have to go man for man with Alabama on a piece of paper. You don't have to go man for man with Georgia because he understands the way to take that sponge and squeeze every last drop of offensive potential out of it, especially. But the thing about Freeze's teams is when he's won, it hasn't been 56-49. He's had good defenses as well, and they've already got that in place here. I don't think that identity is going anywhere. I just think starting next year and especially the year after, when you talk about SEC championship picture, Auburn will either be involved or you'll have to go through Auburn to get there.
All right, so tomorrow, Deep South's oldest rivalry. Kind of want you to maybe look into the camera, tell the fans, what do you think is going to happen? Predictions, Auburn versus Georgia.
Okay, so this is my key shot right here?
Yep.
Okay. I would not be here. Excuse me. I would not be here if I didn't think this was going to be a close game. And while the rest of America, and especially the SEC, looks at Auburn last week, falling to Texas A&M and maybe writing them off, I look at it and say, that is college football script for expect a big bounce back the next week. And also, anyone out there who's watching this probably understands the flavor of this rivalry. And when it's played in this building especially, there's nothing that can be taken for granted. No one in Athens, Georgia, in other words, has looked over this game. They've kind of circled this game and known, even if we are the better team, man, we're in a dogfight. We're in for a dogfight down there. Pun kind of intended. So where I landed on this one is I leaned Georgia to win the game, but anything above and beyond, when you get in the world of like point spreads and whatnot, I would not be laying double digits here. Like I really feel like it's a 4-quarter game. And I feel, look, if this is a 27-20 game and I'm Kirby Smart in Georgia, I'd be happy to get out of here with that. But if it doesn't go that way, if you actually do have the upset to happen, that is probably the boulder that kind of gets knocked down the hill in college football this year, because I think everyone's watched the other upsets happen, but they've sort of reverted back to thinking as long as Georgia's there, as long as Michigan's there, that'll be the national championship. And all the rest of this stuff beneath it is whatever. But if one or both of those teams trip up at any point, then it's really game on.
Thank you so much for joining us. I've enjoyed interviewing you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.